Sensationalism is dead. Mainstream media is a lie. Welcome to Dismantle the Media, the podcast where we strip away the rating-driven narratives and give you the truth the media kept to themselves. Let's unpack it.
Today, we are discussing the mainstream media and all of their narratives. Let's unpack this. Usually when we start a deep dive, we're looking at something specific, a historical event, a tech breakthrough, a new medical study.
Right, something tangible.
Exactly. But today feels different. Today, we are looking at the lens itself. We're looking at the thing that tells us what's happening in the world.
It is a meta-analysis.
Yeah.
In the truest sense of the word. We're using media sources, studies, reports, legal documents to analyze the media.
And the picture that emerges, frankly, it's not a pretty one.
No. I think unflattering is probably a very polite way to put it. The stack of research we're drawing from today, it paints a picture of an industry that is, in many ways, structurally designed to create conflict, not report on it.
That's the thing that hit me. I was reading through the source material last night, and I just kept having this sinking feeling. We all grow up with this idea of the news as the fourth estate, right?
The watchdog.
The watchdog. The thing that's supposed to keep government and corporations honest. But the phrase that kept popping up in these documents wasn't watchdog. It was the architecture of outrage.
And that is the core concept we really need to grapple with today. The architecture of outrage. It suggests that what we're seeing, the sensationalism, the polarization, the constant fear-mongering, isn't just a series of accidental mistakes.
It's not just a few bad reporters having a bad day.
Exactly. It suggests the design. It suggests that the system is built to produce outrage because, at the end of the day, outrage is the most profitable commodity they have.
And that's a terrifying thought, because if the system is designed to make us angry or scared, then news isn't information anymore.
No.
It's emotional manipulation. It's selling us anxiety.
Precisely. The sources we looked at argue that we've moved from a model of public service to a model of, and this is a quote, the commodification of justice.
The commodification of justice. Wow.
Yeah. We're seeing this massive collision between two constitutional forces. On one hand, you have the First Amendment, which gives the press the right to say pretty much whatever they want.
The right to a free press.
Right. But on the other hand, you have the Sixth Amendment, which guarantees every citizen the right to a fair trial.
With an impartial jury.
And the argument here, the one laid out in the legal analyses, is that in the modern media landscape, the First Amendment is basically eating the Sixth Amendment alive. The right to a fair trial is being completely eroded by the media's need for a narrative.
We are absolutely going to see that in bright, horrifying detail when we get to the Duke Lacrosse case later on. I have to say, that was the part of the research that just made me genuinely angry.
It's a textbook example.
But before we get there, we have a lot of ground to cover. We're actually starting a new series here on sensationalism, and this episode is, the foundation. We have to understand the mechanics. Why is the media focused on ratings over truth?
And is it just incompetence? Is it malice? Or is it something more structural? Is it just economics?
So here's the roadmap for this deep dive. First, we have to follow the money. We're going to look at the economics of toxicity, the business model of what's called infotainment.
Why, if it bleeds, it leads is not just a catchy phrase, it's a financial strategy.
Exactly. Second, we're going to take a tour of what I'm calling the fabrication factory. We aren't just talking about spinning a story a little bit. We are talking about reporters at the biggest, most prestigious institutions in the world. We're talking the New York Times, Rolling Stone, the Washington Post, literally making things up.
And not just small details either. We're talking about inventing people from whole cloth, inventing crimes.
Yeah, it's mind-boggling. Then from there, we're going to do a deep forensic analysis of the Duke Lacrosse case, which, as I said, our sources call a media lynching. It's the ultimate example of when the narrative matters more than the DNA.
And finally, we have to look at the human cost of all of this. What does this constant diet of fear and outrage do to our brains, to our society? And what does it do to the people who get chewed up by this machine?
It's a heavy docket.
It is, but it's essential. If we don't understand how the news is made, we can't possibly understand the world it's describing to us.
So let's start with the engine, section 1, the economics. One of the papers we have here, The Architecture of Outrage, makes a distinction that I think is really, really important. It talks about the shift from journalism to infotainment.
Right.
And I know infotainment sounds like a buzzword from the 90s, but the structural change behind it is profound.
It is the fundamental shift of the last 40 years.
Mm-hmm.
To really understand this, you have to go back in time a bit. Decades ago, for the major networks, your CBS, NBC, ABC, the news division was what we call a loss leader.
Okay, you mentioned this term loss leader in our pre-show chat. Let's clarify that for everyone. That's a retail term, isn't it? Like when a grocery store sells milk for super cheap, even losing money on it just to get you in the door so you'll buy the expensive cereal and everything else.
That is the perfect analogy. For a very long time, the big networks did not expect their news divisions to make a profit. In fact, they planned on them losing money. Absolutely. It was the price of prestige. It was considered a public service, something required by the FCC in exchange for their broadcast licenses. They made all their real money on sitcoms, on game shows, on variety shows. The news was just something they did because they had a civic duty. It was the vegetables portion of their programming.
That sounds like a completely different planet compared to the media landscape we live in today.
It was a different universe. But then came the 1980s. You have deregulation under Reagan, and you have the rise of these massive corporate ownership structures. Suddenly, the news division wasn't a prestige project anymore. It was just another department on a spreadsheet, and it was expected to pay its own way. It had to become a profit center.
And then you throw in the real game changer.
The 24-hour news cycle, the invention of cable news.
Right, CNN. Suddenly, you don't just have 30 minutes at 6 p.m. to fill. You have 24 hours every single day, 7 days a week.
And that creates a massive, almost unsolvable logistical problem because facts are scarce.
What do you mean by that?
Actual, verifiable, important news events, things that really matter to your life, they just don't happen every hour of every day. But the airtime is infinite. It's a monster that has to be fed constantly, so you have to fill the void.
So if you don't have actual news, what do you fill it with?
You fill it with commentary, you fill
Yeah.
it with speculation, you fill it with two people yelling at each other, you bring on a panel of people to argue about what might happen or what something could mean, you turn the news into a soap opera, a drama, and most importantly, you have to find a way to keep people watching through the commercial breaks.
This is where that quote from the network executive comes in. I circled this in the notes because it was just so brazen. It's a CEO of a major network admitting that controversial figures, specifically during election cycles, were, and I'm quoting, good for the company because the money's rolling in.
It's the quiet part out loud. It's a simple, brutal equation. Ratings equal advertising revenue. That's it. That's the whole business. And if you put a calm, rational expert on screen to explain a complex policy in a nuanced way,
People change the channel. It's boring.
it's boring. But if you put two people screaming at each other, or if you frame a story as a terrifying, immediate crisis that threatens you and your family, people stay glued to the screen. Fear is a very, very powerful engagement tool.
And this connects directly to what one of the researchers, David Alfeid, calls the problem frame. Can we dig into that? Because it sounds like a very specific, almost manipulative technique they use.
It is a technique. The problem frame is essentially a narrative template. The media takes an issue. It could be crime, it could be a new virus, it could be immigration, and they strip away all the complexity, all the nuance. They frame it exclusively as a threat,
A simple, scary threat.
a terrifying, immediate threat to you, the viewer. They find the scariest possible angle and they zoom in on it, blowing it up until it's all you can see.
So they create the anxiety.
They manufacture the anxiety. They intentionally induce a fear response in the audience. And then, and this is the crucial part of the model, the solution to that anxiety isn't to go out and vote or to organize or to fix the problem. The solution is to keep watching the coverage.
Oh, that's insidious.
It is. They are selling you the virus, which is fear, and the supposed cure, which is more information from them, in the exact same package. But the cure doesn't actually cure you. It just exposes you to more of the virus, keeping you in that state of heightened anxiety and therefore keeping you tuned in.
It's a feedback loop, an addiction loop. And it reminds me of that other theory we read about from Brigitte Nakos regarding the media's insatiable appetite.
Yes, Nakos's work is really foundational here. She argues that the modern media has an insatiable appetite for violence and for what she calls dramatic visuals. This is the academic version of that old, cynical newsroom saying,
If it bleeds, it leads.
exactly. But she says it's more than just a habit or a cynical choice. It's become the very definition of sensationalism itself.
Right. She defines sensationalism as content that is specifically designed to provoke immediate emotional responses rather than to inform. It's about triggering your lizard brain, not engaging your prefrontal cortex.
Precisely. And we can actually see this measured in the data. There was a fascinating study in our sources that did a head-to-head comparison of two very different shows, 60 Minutes and Hard Copy.
Hard copy. Wow, that brings me back. For our younger listeners, you have to imagine a TV show that was basically a tabloid magazine come to life.
Chuckles, that's a good way to put it.
Flashy graphics, ominous voiceovers, hidden cameras, reenactments. It was the definition of salacious.
Total trash TV. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you have 60 Minutes, which is supposed to be the gold standard of serious, highbrow broadcast journalism. So the researchers coded the content of both shows.
And as you'd expect, hard copy was off the charts.
Completely. They used all those techniques you mentioned, flashy camera work, dramatic music, and the content analysis found that 56% of their stories were about celebrities, scandal, and crime.
Okay, so that tracks. Hard copy is the junk food, 60 Minutes is the vegetables, case closed, right?
Mostly. But here is the twist in the data that really surprised me. And it speaks to how this infotainment model has seeped into everything. While 60 Minutes focused more on politics and economics, the study noted that even these highbrow outlets are not immune to the pressure. They still have to frame their stories in a dramatic way to keep the audience.
So even the good journalism has to borrow from the tabloid playbook to survive.
They do. But the most surprising fact came when they looked at newspapers. There was a very strange inverse relationship that they found.
Yeah, this part confused me at first. I would have thought the big national papers, the ones with millions of readers, would be the ones most desperate to keep those numbers up so they'd be more sensational. But the study says the lower market papers were actually worse.
Much worse. The study found that about 70% of the content in lower market newspapers, so think local papers, smaller circulation outlets, was coded as sensational.
70%?
A huge number. And that was compared to the upper market papers like the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times, which had a much lower sensationalism score.
Why would that be? You'd think the little guys would be more focused on, the city council meeting and the high school football game. Less Hollywood.
It comes back to the pure economics of survival. The upper market papers are selling credibility. That is their brand. Their core audience subscribes because they believe the reporting is accurate and sober. If you're a Wall Street trader, you need the journal to be right.
But the smaller papers?
They are fighting for their lives. They are competing with television, with the internet, with everything else for a slice of your attention. They're desperate. They have to grab your eyeball.
So when you're drowning, you don't worry about dignity. You just splash as hard as you can.
You splash. You use emotional, loaded language. You hype up the local crime blotter to make it sound like a terrifying crime wave.
Yeah.
You do whatever it takes to get someone to pick up that paper or click on that link, because without it, you go out of business next month.
And all of that constant splashing, that constant hype and fear, it has a real measurable effect on how the audience sees the entire world.
Which brings us to mean world syndrome. This is one of the most robust, most replicated findings in media psychology. A researcher named George Gerbner coined the term decades ago, and it's more relevant now than ever.
And the concept is basically what it sounds like, right?
It is. Heavy consumers of news, especially television news, come to believe that the world is a significantly more dangerous and frightening place than it actually is.
They think the world is mean.
They believe crime is out of control. They believe they are personally likely to be a victim of a violent crime, that they could be assaulted or murdered at any moment. And the data shows this belief persists even when actual real-world crime rates are going down.
So you can be living in the safest period in human history, statistically speaking, but if you watch 6 hours of cable news a day, your brain thinks you're living in a war zone.
Exactly. Because the emotional center of your brain, the amygdala, it reacts viscerally to the visual of violence or the story of a threat. It doesn't pause to check the FBI crime statistics from last year before it elevates your heart rate and your cortisol levels. It just reacts.
And this gets even more complicated and frankly more toxic when we start to layer race on top of this.
Oh, absolutely. The source material had a very specific study on this, looking at the coverage of the George Zimmerman and Trayvon Martin case.
What did that study find?
It was very revealing. It showed that high exposure to what they called racialized media definitely increases the audience's perceptions of injustice. But, and this is the key, it affects different racial and ethnic groups differently. It doesn't bring people together in a shared understanding. It actually splits reality apart.
The framing is everything.
It is the only thing.
Yeah.
The study pointed to another more recent example, The Dylan Roof case. The horrific mass shooting at the Emmanuel AME Church in Charleston.
I remember that.
The study noted that an outlet like Fox News framed that attack largely as being anti-religious. They focused on the fact that it happened in a church. Meanwhile, an outlet like CNN framed it primarily as racial. They focused on Roof's white supremacist manifesto. So depending on which channel you watch, you are literally being told a different story about the fundamental motive of a real-world event.
And that framing gives the audience a psychological off-ramp, doesn't it?
It does. If you're someone who is uncomfortable confronting the idea of systemic racism, the anti-religious frame allows you to be angry and horrified about the crime without having to question the broader societal structure. It lets you process the tragedy in a way that confirms your existing worldview.
So the media isn't just selling us facts, they are curating our reality to fit our pre-existing biases, because that's what keeps us watching. It's the ultimate form of customer service.
That's the economic engine in a nutshell. But now I want to bridge to something that's even darker. So far, we've been talking about how they spin real events, how they hype up things that actually happen.
Right.
But there's a step beyond that. What happens when the pressure to feed the beast, to fill that 24-hour void, is so high that reporters stop looking for news and start inventing it?
The fabrication factory.
Exactly. This is where the architecture of outrage becomes the architecture of lies.
This section of the research was just, it was fascinating because, again, we're not talking about some teenager in a basement writing fake news for clicks on Facebook.
No.
We are talking about the most prestigious, most respected institutions in journalism, the ones we're told we can trust.
We are. And we have to start with the case of Jason Blair and the New York Times.
2003. I remember when this broke, it was like an earthquake shook the entire media world. But looking back at the details now, the sheer scale of the deception is just hard to wrap your head around.
It really is. This wasn't one slip-up or a misquoted source. This was a sustained campaign of fraud over several years. Jason Blair was a young, rising star at the Times. He was considered a prodigy.
They were grooming him for big things.
They were. But behind the scenes, he was struggling with substance abuse and significant mental health issues, and the pressure to perform was immense. So he started cutting corners. And then he stopped cutting corners and just started inventing the corners himself.
The story that really sticks out to me from the report on his case is the Jessica Lynch one. For those who don't remember, she was the Army private who was captured and then famously rescued in Iraq. It was the biggest story in the country at the time.
A huge story. And Blair wrote a front-page story for the Times describing the anguish of her family back home in West Virginia.
And it was beautiful writing. He described the tobacco fields, the winding roads, the view from their front porch. He described the raw emotions of her father as he waited for news. It was incredibly moving, detailed reporting. He wasn't in West Virginia.
Not even close. He was in his apartment in Brooklyn, New York. He was looking at photos from the Associated Press and reading wire service reports and then just writing fiction. He fabricated quotes. He fabricated entire scenes. He was filing stories with datelines from Maryland, from Virginia, from Texas, while never leaving his apartment.
Okay, now I have to play devil's advocate here, or maybe just the naive observer. I work in a collaborative environment. If I tried to fake a major project for my job, somebody would notice, my boss would notice. How does an editor at the New York Times, the supposed guardian of journalistic truth, not say, "Hey, Jason, can I see your plane ticket receipts? Where's your hotel bill from West Virginia?"
That is the pivotal question. And the source material, including the Times' own internal investigation, points to a systemic institutional failure. It was a culture of trust, not supervise.
What does that mean?
The editors wanted him to be the star. They were deeply invested in his success. And there were actually numerous warnings. The reports show that other editors, lower down the chain, had complained for years about his sloppiness, about factual errors in his previous reporting. But the top executive leadership, specifically the executive editor Howell Raines and the managing editor Gerald Boyd, they protected him. They pushed him forward.
They ignored the smoke because they really wanted the fire.
They wanted the scoop, and they wanted the narrative of this brilliant young African-American reporter conquering the world. It's a classic case where the desire for a specific outcome completely blinded them to the reality of the process, and when it all collapsed, the institutional blowback was enormous. Raines and Boyd were both forced to resign in disgrace.
But Blair wasn't a one-off incident. The research highlights several others. Let's talk about Stephen Glass at the New Republic. This one feels different because Glass seems, well, almost like a sociopath in how meticulous he was with his deception.
Glass was what one of our sources calls a charismatic fabricator. That's a key term. He didn't just lie. He built an entire support structure, an entire Potemkin village to prop up his lies.
Let's talk about the story Hack Heaven. This is the one that brought him down.
Yes, in 1998, he wrote this gripping feature story about a 15-year-old computer hacker who had broken into a major software company system. And the story was that instead of calling the police, the company was so impressed that they hired the kid to be their new head of cybersecurity.
It's a perfect story. It's got everything. A teenage wonderkind, corporate extortion, the strange new world of the early internet. It's a movie pitch.
And it was complete and utter garbage.
100% fiction.
Total fiction. There was no hacker. There was no software company called Duke Lacrosse. But here is the brilliant, twisted part of his method. When the fact-checkers at the New Republic and later at Forbes started asking for verification, Glass was ready. He created fake websites for the fake company. He designed and printed fake business cards. He created a fake company phone number that went to a payphone. He even had his own brother pose as a Duke Lacrosse executive on the phone to fool another fact-checker.
That is just so much work. At a certain point, wouldn't it have been easier to just go find a real story?
You would think so. But Glass was a performer. He knew exactly what his editors wanted. He knew they didn't really understand technology. This was the late 90s, remember? He played directly into their stereotypes of what hacker culture must look like. He gave them the story they wanted to believe was true. And that is the common thread in all these big fabrication cases. The editors drop their guard because the lie confirms their own biases.
We see that with Janet Cook at the Washington Post, too. Her story, Jimmy's World.
A truly heart-wrenching profile of an 8-year-old heroin addict living in the slums of Washington, D.C. It was so powerful, so evocative of the urban drug crisis that she won the Pulitzer Prize for it in 1981.
And Jimmy didn't exist.
He did not. She made him up. She eventually confessed and had to return the Pulitzer. But your question is the right one. Why did it run? It ran because the editors at the Post, who were living in and covering a city ravaged by the drug epidemic, read it and thought, this feels true. This represents the horror that we know is out there. They let what Stephen Colbert would later call truthiness override the actual verifiable facts.
And this brings us to a more recent and in some ways even more damaging example, the 2014 Rolling Stone article, A Rape on Campus.
Yes, this is a crucial case for our architecture of outrage thesis because it happened in the modern viral internet era. The reporter, Sabrina Erdley, wrote a shocking, incredibly graphic account of a gang rape at a fraternity at the University of Virginia. The story was centered on a single source, a student who was given the pseudonym Jackie.
I remember this vividly. I was in college when it came out. The story went everywhere. Instantly, the fallout was nuclear. The University of Virginia suspended all fraternity activities on campus. There were protests. It became this massive national flashpoint for the discussion on campus sexual assault.
It did. It was the perfect narrative for the moment. But the foundation of that narrative was pure sand. The reporter, Early, had failed to do the most basic journalistic checks.
What'd she miss?
She never spoke to the men Jackie accused of the rape. She never independently verified that the party Jackie described actually happened on that specific night. She never talked to the friends Jackie claimed to have confided in immediately after the assault. She relied almost entirely and uncritically on Jackie's account.
And when the police investigated, there was nothing.
Nothing. No evidence that the event as described ever took place. The story completely unraveled, and Rolling Stone was sued for defamation. Now, this is where we need to explain a really important legal term that came up in the lawsuit, actual malice.
Yeah, let's unpack that. Because in the U.S., it is notoriously difficult for a public figure or an institution to win a libel suit against the press. You have to prove this thing called actual malice. And that doesn't just mean the reporter was being mean, right?
Correct. It has nothing to do with spite or ill will. In a legal context, actual malice means you have to prove that the publisher either knew the information was false when they published it, or, and this is the key part, they acted with reckless disregard for whether it was true or not.
Reckless disregard.
That is the standard. And the jury in the defamation case found that Rolling Stone had, in fact, acted with actual malice. And why? Because, effectively, they had consciously avoided looking for facts that would have contradicted and killed their story. They wanted the narrative of rampant rape culture at elite universities so badly that they chose not to look under the rocks where they might have found something that disproved it.
They prioritized the pre-approved narrative over the truth.
That is the absolute definition of the architecture of outrage. The story was too good, too outrageous, too clickable, too culturally impactful to check.
Before we move on to the next section, we have to mention one more example, a visual one, because it's just so absurdly blatant. NBC Dateline and the exploding truck.
Laughs. It is hard to believe this actually happened at a major network, but it did. In 1992, NBC's Dateline wanted to do a big expose proving that certain models of GM pickup trucks were unsafe because their gas tanks would allegedly explode in a side impact crash.
So they decided to stage a crash for the cameras.
They did. They set up a test. But when they ran the test crashes, the trucks, well, they didn't explode.
That's kind of a problem for the story you're trying to tell.
A major problem. So what do? Did they say, well, I guess our premise was wrong, the trucks are safer than we thought? No. They decided to help the story along. They rigged the GM trucks with remote-controlled incendiary devices. They literally strapped model rocket engines explosives to the gas tanks to ensure that they would get the dramatic fireball on camera.
They literally rigged the news to blow up.
They did. And of course, GM found out, they sued, and it was a massive, humiliating scandal for NBC News. But it perfectly illustrates the mindset. The visual, the fireball, the outrage was more important than the reality. They needed the bleed, so they created it.
Okay, so we've seen the economics of fear. We've seen the literal fabrication of stories. But I think there's a third category that in some ways is even more terrifying. This is when the media doesn't invent the people out of thin air, but they essentially invent the crime. They decide on a verdict before the police have even finished collecting the evidence.
Trial by media.
And the ultimate example of this, according to every source we have, is the Duke Lacrosse case.
This case is the perfect storm. If you were trying to write a screenplay designed to generate maximum outrage and division in America, you could not have written it better than what actually happened in Durham, North Carolina in March of 2006.
Let's set the scene for anyone who doesn't remember the details.
You had a party at an off-campus house. You had the Duke University lacrosse team, a group of mostly white, wealthy, privileged athletes from an elite school.
The arrogant jocks archetype.
Exactly. Then you have an African-American exotic dancer who was hired to perform at the party. After the party, she goes to the police and accuses 3 of the players of dragging her into a bathroom and brutally gang raping her.
Race, class, sex, privilege, North versus South. It hit every single nerve ending in the American psyche.
Every single one.
Yeah.
And the national media descended on Durham like a swarm. But the engine of this particular outrage machine wasn't just the reporters, it was the local prosecutor, District Attorney Mike Nafong.
The rogue prosecutor.
Nafong was in the middle of a very tough primary election. He was in danger of losing his job, and he saw this case as political gold. He immediately did something that is almost unheard of in the legal profession. He went on a media blitz. The reports say he gave over 50 interviews about the case while it was still under investigation.
50. Most district attorneys won't even tell you what they had for lunch while a case is open because they are so terrified of tainting the jury pool.
It's a massive ethical breach. But Nafong was everywhere. He went on national television and stated unequivocally that he was convinced a rape occurred before all the evidence was even in. He claimed there was a deep racial motivation for the crime. He was on TV calling the players hooligans and talking about their guilt as if it were a proven fact. He was trying the case on the evening news, not in a courtroom.
And the media just lapped it up. They amplified everything he said without question.
They did. The New York Times, Newsweek, every cable news channel, they all ran with the narrative of the privileged jock rapists. It fit the problem frame perfectly. It confirmed what a lot of people already wanted to believe about rich, white athletes. The narrative was just too good to check.
But then the facts started to come in. Or, more accurately, the stunning lack of facts.
The DNA. This was the turning point that should have stopped the entire media train in its tracks. But the train had no brakes. Nafong had gone on TV and claimed that DNA evidence would be the absolute foundation of his case. The accuser had said she was raped by multiple men and that no condoms were used.
So there should have been DNA everywhere. It should have been an open and shut case.
You'd think so.
Yeah.
They collected DNA samples from every single white player on the lacrosse team, 46 men. The lab results came back, and the result was 0.
Nothing.
Not a single match. There was no DNA from any Duke player on the accuser's body or clothing. In fact, the only DNA they found belonged to other men who were not on the lacrosse team.
And the accuser's story itself was falling apart too, right?
It was a mess. It was wildly inconsistent. First she said it was 5 men, then 3. She couldn't describe her attackers accurately. She changed the details of the assault multiple times in interviews with police.
So let's recap. You have no physical evidence. You have an accuser whose story keeps changing. You have a prosecutor who is clearly grandstanding for political reasons. Why didn't the media stop? Why didn't a single editor at a major paper say, wait a minute, this whole thing stinks?
Because the narrative was too strong. One of our legal sources refers to the media atmosphere at the time as a public lynching. The media had already decided who the villains were. To backtrack, to admit that maybe, just maybe, the privileged white boys might actually be the victims of a false accusation that didn't fit the script.
It didn't generate outrage, it generated cognitive dissonance.
Exactly. So they just ignored the DNA results, or they downplayed them. They kept running the stories, showing the players' mugshots, treating their guilt as a foregone conclusion.
It wasn't until the Attorney General of North Carolina, a man named Roy Cooper, stepped in that this finally ended.
It did. The case was taken away from the phone. Cooper's office took over the investigation, reviewed all the evidence, and came to a stunning conclusion. When he announced the results, he used language that you almost never, ever hear from a prosecutor in a criminal case. He didn't just say, we are dropping the charges. He didn't just say the players were not guilty.
I declared them innocent.
He specifically said the players were innocent victims of a tragic rush to accuse. In the legal world, that is a unicorn. It almost never happens. It was a total, absolute, unequivocal exoneration.
And what happened to Mike Nafong?
He was disbarred for his misconduct. He ended up spending a brief time in jail for contempt of court. His legal and political career was completely destroyed.
But the damage was done. And this brings us to the final crucial section of our roadmap, the human cost. Because you can declare someone innocent on a piece of paper, but you can't unpublish 1,000 headlines that have already called them a rapist.
This is what sociologists call social death.
That is a chilling term. What does it mean?
It describes the total loss of social standing, identity, and reputation, even if you are later legally cleared. For those 3 young men from Duke, their names were synonymous with rapist across the entire globe for over a year. They were expelled or suspended from an elite university. They were ostracized in their communities. Their families faced death threats.
The Google search never forgets.
Exactly. Even after they were cleared, that brand sticks. For the rest of their lives, when someone meets them and Googles their name, the first 10 results are going to be about a horrific rape trial. Even if the 11th result says innocent, the doubt, the stain is planted. It's a permanent scar on their identity.
And the sources are clear that this kind of media circus also hurts real victims of actual crimes.
Absolutely. This is what's known as secondary victimization.
Yeah.
When the media turns a real sexual assault case into a spectacle, into a political football, it re-traumatizes the actual victim. Their most painful experience becomes public entertainment. And it makes other people, other victims, afraid to come forward because they see what happens. The intense public scrutiny, the politicization, the loss of privacy, the outrage machine chews everyone up.
It just feels like we're looking at a complete ethical void. I mean, journalism as a profession has rules, right? We have SPJ, the Society of Professional Journalists. They have a code of ethics. It's not the Wild West.
They do. And if you read it, it's a very good, very noble code of conduct. It's built on 4 main pillars. The first one is seek truth and report it. That means you verify information before you release it.
Okay, which Rolling Stone, Jason Blair, and Stephen Glass all catastrophically failed at.
Right. The second pillar is minimize harm. This says you should show compassion for those who may be affected by news coverage and that you shouldn't pander to lurid curiosity.
Which the coverage of the Duke case failed at completely. It was nothing but lurid curiosity.
The third is act independently. Refuse gifts, favors, and avoid conflicts of interest. The fourth pillar is be accountable and transparent. You have to admit your mistakes and correct them promptly.
So if these rules exist and they're good rules, why are they so often and so flagrantly ignored?
Because, fundamentally, the code is voluntary. There is no journalism police. You don't lose your license to write if you lie, the way a doctor loses their license to practice medicine if they commit malpractice. There's no real enforcement mechanism beyond professional shame.
And the economic incentives are all pushing in the exact opposite direction of the ethics code.
That's the core conflict. The SPJ code says minimize harm, but the business model of infotainment says maximize drama. The code says act independently. But the business model says to get the scoop by any means necessary, like checkbook journalism, paying sources for stories, which the tabloids do all the time, even though it's ethically dubious because it incentivizes sources to lie.
So if running a sensational, unverified story gets you 10 million clicks on Tuesday, and the quiet retraction you post 3 weeks later only gets 10,000 clicks, The math says you run the lie.
The math says the outrage is profitable and the correction is not.
That is a deeply depressing realization. The system is actually designed to reward the violation of its own stated ethics.
It is structural. That's why we keep coming back to that phrase, the architecture of outrage. It is not an accident. It is a design. The combination of intense economic pressure, our own human psychology, our natural fear and fascination with the macabre, and a profound lack of effective oversight creates this incredibly toxic media environment.
So let's try to synthesize all of this. We've covered a lot of ground today. We've seen the economic engine that runs on fear and advertising dollars. We've seen the fabricators who feed that beast with outright lies. We've seen the real human lives that are destroyed when the narrative steamrolls the truth.
It's a comprehensive and I think fairly damning picture of a broken system.
But I want to leave our listeners with a final thought, a bit of a provocation maybe. We've spent the last hour blaming the media. We've blamed the editors, the reporters, the corporate owners, the rogue prosecutors, and they absolutely deserve that blame.
They do.
But you said it yourself at the very beginning. The simple equation is that ratings equal revenue.
Yes, that is the bottom line.
Well, who provides the ratings?
We do. The audience.
We do. We're the ones who click. We're the ones who watch. We share the most outrageous headlines on social media. We're the ones who slow down on the highway to look at the car crash. We scroll right past the boring but important city council report to get to the juicy scandal.
That is the uncomfortable truth in all of this. It is, at its core, a supply and demand problem. As long as there is a massive public demand for outrage, there will be a massive industrial supply of it.
So if it bleeds, it leads as a business model,
Right.
then we're the customers who are keeping that business alive with our attention. So here's the question I want to leave everyone with. Are we the final architects of this outrage?
That is the crucial question, isn't it? If the media truly just gives us what we click on, then the only way to change the media is to change what we, as a collective audience, choose to click on.
We might have to starve the beast. We might have to consciously decide to reward the boring, factual, verified reporting with our attention and to actively ignore, to stop clicking on the bleed.
It requires a conscious effort. It requires us to shift from being passive recipients of emotion to being active, critical consumers of information.
That is a heavy responsibility, but after everything we've talked about today, I think it might be the only way out. Thank you for walking us through this architecture.
It was a pleasure. Stay curious and stay critical.
Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.